The clamor of the Sanjo Bridge Market was a constant, living thing, a symphony of shouts and shuffling feet that had echoed through Kyoto for generations. Kenji, barely old enough to shave the peach fuzz from his chin, navigated the crush with the practiced ease of a fishmonger's apprentice. His shoulders, still narrow but strengthening with each passing season, were perpetually burdened by wicker baskets overflowing with glistening sea bream or wriggling eels. The air, thick with the scent of brine, charcoal, and the sweet perfume of plum blossoms from a nearby tea house, was the only world he truly knew. It was the year 1642. The Tokugawa shogunate, less than half a century old, had settled the land into a fragile peace after centuries of civil war. Samurai, once warriors on horseback, were now bureaucrats in castles, their blades more ornamental than deadly. But peace, Kenji was learning, had its own shadows. He remembered his grandfather, a man with calloused hands and a quiet wisdom, speaking of the old days. The samurai kept order, boy, he grumbled, his voice raspy with age and sake. But they were like hungry dogs, always looking for a fight. Now, they sit fat, but the streets are still hungry. And the streets were indeed hungry. With fewer wars to fight, many samurai, particularly the lower-ranking ones and the masterless ronin, found themselves adrift. Their traditional roles vanished, replaced by the mundane realities of a burgeoning merchant economy they barely understood and often disdained. Some turned to honest work, but many others, clinging to their swords and their pride, became a menace. They called them kabukimono, the strange ones. Kenji had seen them. Their hair was often styled in bizarre, exaggerated topknots, their kimonos splashed with garish colors and patterns that defied common decency. They wore oversized swords, carried tobacco pipes longer than his arm, and swaggered through the narrow alleys, their faces a mask of insolence. They were quick to draw steel, quicker to intimidate, and their favorite pastime seemed to be provoking trouble, often for no other reason than to assert their fading dominance. He'd witnessed their games of sujigiri, crossroads killing, where a bored kabukimono would test the sharpness of his blade on an unsuspecting passerby. The memory still sent a chill down his spine, a sudden scream, the thud of a body, and the swift, silent dispersal of the crowd, leaving only the dead and the chilling, triumphant laughter of the killer. The authorities, still finding their footing in this new era of peace, seemed either unwilling or unable to control them. A samurai's life was still considered inherently more valuable than a commoner's, and justice, for the everyday people, was a luxury rarely afforded. One sweltering afternoon, as Kenji hawked his fish near the entrance of a bustling tea-house, a commotion erupted. A group of 5 kabukimono, their leader a hulking brute with a scarred face and a sneer, had cornered a young merchant. The merchant, trembling, clutched a small money pouch. "A toll, little sparrow," the scarred man growled, his voice like grinding stones. "For safe passage through our streets." But I paid yesterday," the merchant stammered, his eyes darting frantically for help that would not come. The kabukimono leader laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Yesterday was yesterday. Today is today. And today, your purse looks heavy." He gestured, and one of his men roughly seized the pouch. Kenji watched, frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was a daily occurrence, a petty tyranny that chipped away at the lives of ordinary people. He saw the desperation in the merchant's eyes, the humiliation. He also saw the fear in the faces of the onlookers, their gazes fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet the eyes of the thugs. Then, a new sound cut through the market din. A measured, rhythmic clap of wooden sandals, deliberate and unhurried. A small group of men, perhaps 10 or 12, moved through the crowd. Unlike the flamboyant kabukimono, these men wore plain, indigo-dyed kimonos, some patched, some faded, but all worn with a quiet dignity. Their hair was neatly tied, their faces unadorned by the exaggerated makeup of their rivals. They carried no oversized weapons, only the standard wakizashi tucked into their obi, and some had a sturdy wooden staff. These were the makiyako, town servants. Their leader was a man of medium height, perhaps in his late 20s, with keen, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. His name, Kenji had heard whispered, was Aizo. He walked with an air of quiet authority, his gaze sweeping over the scene, missing nothing. Aizo stopped a few paces from the kabukimono and the terrified merchant. He didn't raise his voice, didn't draw a weapon. He simply spoke, his voice clear and steady. "Is there a problem here, brother?" The scarred kabuki mono leader turned, his sneer deepening. "This is none of your concern, Makiyako. Go back to polishing your floors." Aizo didn't flinch. "These streets are the concern of all who live and work in them. This merchant is under our protection." A ripple went through the crowd. Our protection. It was a phrase Kenji had heard more and more often. The Makiyako were organizing, forming loosely knit groups of commoners, often firemen, laborers, or small shopkeepers, who sought to defend their communities from the predations of the kabukimono and the indifference of the official samurai class. They were, in their own way, filling a void left by the changing times. The scarred kabukimono barked a laugh. "Protection? You have nothing. No rank, no name, no power." Aizo took a slow step forward. "We have our numbers. We have our purpose. And we have our conviction. This man's money will be returned." For a moment, the market held its breath. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Kenji watched Aizo's eyes, saw the unwavering resolve there. He saw the way the other Makiyako had positioned themselves, subtly, blocking potential escape routes for the kabukimono. These were not mere bullies. They were organized. The scarred leader, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, and perhaps weighing the numerical disadvantage, hesitated. His gaze flickered from Aizo's calm face to the determined expressions of the other Makiyako. He knew a direct confrontation would be bloody, and even if they won, it would draw unwanted attention from the shogunate authorities, who might finally decide to crack down on all unruly elements. With a grunt of disgust, he tossed the money pouch back at the merchant, who fumbled to catch it. "This is not over, Makiyako," he spat, his eyes narrowed in a promise of future retribution. Then, with a frustrated wave, he led his men away, their swagger diminished, their bravado deflated. The merchant, trembling, bowed deeply to Aizo. "Thank you, Aizo-san." "Thank you." Aizo merely nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He turned to his men, a silent understanding passing between them. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, let out a collective sigh of relief, then began to murmur, a low hum of approval. Kenji, still clutching his basket of fish, felt a strange mix of fear and admiration. He had seen the power of the kabukimono, the destructive force of their lawlessness. But today, he had seen something else, the quiet, disciplined power of those who dared to stand against it. He had seen the birth of an order, albeit an unofficial one, rising from the chaos. He watched Aizo and his men move through the market, their presence a silent promise of protection. But as he watched them disappear into the labyrinthine alleys of Kyoto, a new thought, cold and unsettling, began to form in Kenji's young mind. These men, these Makiyako, had brought a semblance of order to the streets, yes. But what would happen when their numbers grew? What would happen when their power became undeniable? And what would they demand in return for their protection? The sun, sinking towards the western hills, cast long, distorted shadows across the market stalls. The clatter of wooden sandals continued, but now, to Kenji's ears, it carried a different rhythm, a pulse of something new and formidable beginning to beat in the heart of the city. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the streets of Japan were changing, and with them, the very nature of power. The old ways were dying, but the new ways, forged in the desperation of common folk and the ambition of forgotten warriors, were only just beginning to take root. And he, Kenji, would bear witness to it all. The sun's final rays that evening did not dissipate Kenji's unease. Instead, they seemed to solidify it, hardening into a cold certainty. The Makiyako, once a scattered collection of self-appointed guardians, began to coalesce. Their victory in the market that day, small as it was, had been a signal. It told the ordinary folk of Kyoto that there was a new force, one that dared to challenge the brazen cruelty of the kabukimono. It also told the kabukimono that their days of unchecked swagger were numbered. In the weeks and months that followed, the murmurs of approval for Aizo and his men grew louder. Merchants, emboldened, began to seek them out, not just in times of crisis, but for ongoing protection. The donations they offered were initially genuine expressions of gratitude, small sums of copper or rice, a share of their meager profits. But as the Makiyako presence became more regular, more expected, these donations began to morph. They became less voluntary, more like an unspoken fee, a necessary cost of doing business in a city where the official law was either absent or indifferent. Kenji, now a young man of 15, had found work in a busy fish market near the Kumo River. From his stall, he watched the transformation unfold. He saw the subtle nods of recognition Aizo's men received, the deferential bows, the fear mixed with relief in the eyes of those who paid. He saw how the Makiyako grew in number, attracting not just disaffected townsmen, but also ronin masterless samurai, their swords sharpen their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder, or in this case, to the most compelling cause. These were men who had known discipline, but also violence, and they brought a hardened edge to Aizo's ranks. Aizo, for his part, remained an enigma. His calm demeanor never wavered, even as his organization swelled. He spoke little, but his decisions were swift and absolute. He established clear territories, or turfs, for his lieutenants, each responsible for keeping the peace and collecting the contributions from the businesses within their domain. He arbitrated disputes between merchants, his word carrying more weight than any magistrate's decree. He even organized clean-up efforts in neglected alleys, earning him genuine goodwill from the common folk, who saw him as a benevolent, if stern, protector. But the Kabuki-mono did not vanish. They merely retreated into the shadows, their resentment festering. The confrontations grew more brutal, less about snatched money pouches and more about control. One cold autumn night, a gambling den overseen by one of Aizo's lieutenants was set ablaze. 3 men died in the flames, their screams echoing across the city. The response was swift and merciless. Aizo himself led the retaliatory raid, descending upon a known Kabuki-mono stronghold in the city's northern district. Kenji heard the rumors the next morning, a dozen Kabuki-mono bodies found floating in the river, their limbs severed, their faces unrecognizable. The message was clear: challenge Aizo, and you would pay a price far greater than any stolen coin. The shogunate authorities, distant in Edo, seemed content to let these street wars rage, as long as they didn't spill into the samurai districts or disrupt the flow of commerce too severely. A quiet understanding seemed to form. The Makiyako, despite their unofficial status, were providing a stability that the shogunate itself was unwilling or unable to guarantee. They were a crude instrument of order, but an instrument nonetheless. It was around this time that Kenji, struggling to support his widowed mother, found himself drawn into the orbit of the Makiyako. His quick wit and sharp eyes had been noticed by one of Aizo's men, a burly former sumo wrestler named Goro, who oversaw the fish market. Goro offered Kenji a job, not as a fighter, but as a runner, carrying messages, collecting small payments, and keeping an ear to the ground for any trouble brewing. It paid better than selling fish, and it came with the unspoken promise of protection for his family. Kenji, with a mix of apprehension and a burgeoning sense of importance, accepted. He quickly learned the unspoken rules of this new world. Loyalty was paramount, a sacred bond forged in shared danger. Disobedience was met with swift, brutal punishment. He saw men with intricate tattoos begin to appear among the ranks, symbols of their allegiance and their chosen path, etched permanently onto their skin. These were not the haphazard marks of the Kabuki-mono, these were deliberate, artful designs, telling stories of dragons and tigers, of courage and sacrifice. He saw how Aizo presided over what were called oyabun koban ceremonies, where new members swore fealty, drinking sake from a shared cup with their designated father, their oyabun. It was a family, but one bound not by blood, but by a rigorous code of honor and mutual obligation. Aizo himself was the ultimate oyabun, the father figure to a growing network of loyal sons. The Makiyako were no longer just protectors, they were becoming an alternate government, a parallel society. They expanded beyond protection rackets. They opened their own gambling dens, the Bakuto, where dice rattled and fortunes were won and lost, all under their watchful eye. They controlled the street vendors. The takiya, ensuring fair play, but also taking a cut of every transaction. They were becoming indispensable, woven into the very fabric of Kyoto's bustling underworld. Kenji, now privy to the inner workings, saw the moral compromises. He saw the fear they instilled, even in those they protected. He saw men who had once been victims become perpetrators, wielding their newfound power with a heavy hand. He saw Aizo, who had once returned a merchant's money, now demanding a portion of it as a matter of course. The line between protecting the innocent and profiting from their fear had blurred, then vanished entirely. One sweltering summer evening, as cicadas buzzed with relentless urgency, Kenji stood outside a crowded Bakuto house, collecting payments from the winners. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the clatter of dice. Suddenly, a commotion erupted. A group of men, larger and more heavily armed than any kabukimano Kenji had ever seen, burst through the door. They were not from Kyoto. Their clothes were different, their accents harsh, their faces hard with a cold, professional menace. "This territory belongs to the Kanto clan now," their leader announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. He was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of old scars, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his katana. "Your Oyabun Aizo has grown too comfortable. The shogunate may tolerate his petty fiefdom, but we do not." Kenji froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not a street brawl. This was an invasion. He saw Goro, the burly sumo wrestler, draw his sword, his face grim. The Kanto men were already fanning out, their blades glinting in the dim light. This was the challenge Kenji had instinctively feared from the day he first saw Aizo stand against the kabukimano. The small, localized order Aizo had forged was now threatened by a larger, more ruthless force. The very existence of the Makiyako in Kyoto, and perhaps their nascent way of life, hung in the balance. The clash was inevitable, and Kenji knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would be a baptism of fire for them all. The air in the Bakuto house thickened, not just with tobacco smoke, but with the scent of fear and the metallic tang of imminent violence. The leader of the Kanto clan, his scarred face a mask of cold intent, took a step forward, his hand still on his katana. "Aizo," he repeated, his voice laced with contempt, "your time is over." Goro, the former sumo, moved first, a roar tearing from his throat. His massive frame slammed into the nearest Kanto man, sending him sprawling amidst the dice and overturned sake cups. His sword, a heavy, utilitarian blade, cut a wide arc, forcing the invaders to momentarily recoil. But they were seasoned fighters, not mere street thugs. They moved with a predatory coordination, their blades flashing in the dim light. Kenji, still clutching the collected payments, found himself pushed to the periphery, a witness once more, but this time to a maelstrom he was undeniably part of. He saw Aizo, calm amidst the chaos, draw his own katana. There was no theatricality now, only grim purpose. Aizo moved with a fluid, deadly grace, parrying a thrust, then riposting with a speed that belied his years. He was not just a leader, he was a warrior, honed by a lifetime of hard choices. The Kanto men, superior in number and perhaps in cold discipline, pressed their attack. The clang of steel filled the room, punctuated by grunts and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Kenji saw one of the Kanto men, a lean, quick opponent, bypass Goro and surge towards Aizo, aiming a swift, low cut at his legs. Instinct, sharp and sudden, seized Kenji. He dropped the money satchel, snatched a discarded wooden stool, and swung it with all his might. The stool shattered against the man's head, sending him reeling. It was a clumsy, desperate act, but effective. The Kanto man stumbled, giving Aizo the opening he needed. His katana flashed, and the invader fell, a gasp escaping his lips. Aizo glanced at Kenji, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a grudging acknowledgement. It was enough. Kenji felt a surge of adrenaline, a profound shift from passive observer to active participant. He grabbed a broken table leg, its splintered and crude weapon, and plunged into the fray. He fought not with skill, but with a desperate ferocity. He blocked, he dodged, he jabbed, fueled by a primal need to defend the only semblance of order he had ever known. He sought his comrades, men he had come to know as brothers, fighting with similar desperation. One of the Makiyako, a quiet gambler named Hiro, took a slash across his arm, but continued to fight, his face contorted in pain and rage. Goro, a formidable bulwark, was bleeding from a cut on his shoulder, but he held his ground, his powerful blows driving back two Kanto men simultaneously. The battle raged, a brutal dance of steel and flesh. The leader of the Kanto clan, seeing his men falling, finally faced Aizo. Their blades met with a deafening crash, a duel between two titans of the underworld. The Kanto leader was a brute force, powerful and relentless, each swing designed to cleave. Aizo, however, was a torrent, parrying, weaving, finding the subtle weaknesses in his opponent's stance. He moved like water, flowing around the blows, always seeking the opening. Suddenly, a gasp from the Kanto leader. Aizo's blade, a blur of silver, had found its mark, a deep, precise cut across his sword arm. The man roared in pain and frustration, his katana clattering to the floor. He stared at Aizo, his eyes burning with hatred, but the fight had left him. His remaining men, seeing their leader disarmed and defeated, hesitated. The momentum had shifted. The Makiyako, though bloodied and bruised, stood firm, their eyes blazing. "Leave," Aizo commanded, his voice hoarse but unwavering, his katana still pointed at the fallen leader. "Tell your clan that Kyoto is ours. There will be no second invasion." The Kanto men, their bravado shattered, gathered their wounded leader and retreated, leaving behind a trail of blood and the broken bodies of their fallen. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The Bakuto house was a ruin, dice scattered like teeth, sake barrels overturned, the air heavy with the stench of blood. Aizo slowly lowered his katana, his gaze sweeping over his men. His eyes lingered on Kenji for a moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Kenji, his hands still trembling from the fight, looked down at his own crude weapon, then at the blood on his hands. He had killed. He had defended. He had become one of them, not just in name, but in the crucible of battle. In the days that followed, the victory, though costly, solidified the Makiyako's dominance. Their reputation for ferocity and unwavering loyalty spread like wildfire through Kyoto's underworld. The merchants, though still wary, now looked upon them with a new kind of respect, tinged with fear. The gambling dens and street stalls operated under their explicit protection, their word now law. The lines Kenji had once seen blurring now vanished completely. The Makiyako were no longer just protectors, they were the undisputed rulers of Kyoto's hidden economy. Their Oyabun, Aizo, was no longer merely a charismatic leader, he was a patriarch, a father figure whose authority was absolute, whose decrees were enforced with swift, brutal efficiency. The bonds between the men, forged in the terror of the Kanto invasion, deepened into an unbreakable loyalty. They were Koban, children of the same father, bound by shared blood and a sacred oath. New rituals emerged from the ashes of the conflict. The taking of oaths, the sharing of sake from a single cup, symbolizing their shared fate, their chosen kinship. Some of the men began to adorn their bodies with intricate tattoos, irizumi, depicting dragons and tigers and fierce mythical creatures, symbols of their defiance, their power, their chosen path. These marks were not just decoration, they were a declaration, a permanent etching of their commitment to a life outside the conventional world. Kenji, standing on the perimeter of these developments, observed it all with a newfound clarity. He saw the shift in Aizo, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a hardened resolve. He saw the pride and the fear in the faces of his comrades. He had witnessed the birth of something new, something formidable. They were no longer just a loose collection of street toughs, they were an organization, a family, bound by a code of conduct and a shared future. He looked at his own hands, the calluses from years of work now mingled with the faint scars of the fight. He had chosen this path, or perhaps it had chosen him. He had sought order in a chaotic world, and he had found it, but it was an order built on violence, on fear, and on an unyielding claim to territory. He understood now that the Makiyako, these servants of the town, had become something else entirely. They were the masters, the arbiters, the architects of their own shadow kingdom. As the years turned into decades, and the influence of these organizations spread beyond Kyoto, across the breadth of Japan, the informal structure Aizo had forged would be emulated, adapted, and formalized. The Bakuto and Takiya would become the foundational pillars of a vast, intricate network. The Oyabun-Koban relationship would become the very bedrock of their society. And the name given to those who lived this life, a name whispered in fear and respect, would echo through the generations, a constant reminder of their origins in the forgotten corners of feudal Japan. Kenji, now older, his hair flecked with gray, often found himself gazing at the bustling streets of Kyoto, the very streets he had once sought to protect. The order was there, undeniable. But what had it cost? What had they truly built? A shield against chaos, or a new, more enduring form of it, destined to cast a long, dark shadow over the heart of Japan for centuries to come? The question hung in the humid Kyoto air, unanswered, yet ever present, like the silent, watchful gaze of a dragon etched onto a hardened back.